They said I didn't belong here, Lila whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the midday sun. Dust swirled around the wooden boards of Marshall Creek, carrying the faint scent of hay, leather, and dry earth. The town square, usually quiet at this hour, was alive with the clatter of wagon wheels and the distant barking of a dog. Faces peered from shop windows, hats tilted low to shield eyes from the glare, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Lila's fingers clenched the hem of her faded dress, dirt smudged across pale skin, and she took a hesitant step forward, only for laughter to ripple through the gathering. It was sharp, quick, almost musical in the wrong way, and it cut through the warm air like a sudden gust of wind. A boy with a sun-bleached hat pointed, and others followed, their eyes alight with the thrill of watching someone falter. Lila's heart pounded, echoing in her ears as she moved across the dusty boards, each step hesitant yet necessary. Her dark hair, tangled and stiff with dust, brushed against her shoulders as she tried to pull herself upright. Somewhere above the edge of the square, the sunlight glinted off metal, possibly a spade left leaning against a post, catching her eye for a brief, grounding moment. A stray breeze carried the scent of cooked bread from the bakery down the lane, mingling with the dusty aroma of the square, making her stomach tighten with hunger and anxiety alike. Her knees scraped against the rough wood as she stumbled, and a collective gasp from the crowd followed, though it was quickly drowned out by more laughter, light and cruel, like wind over dry grass. From the corner of her eye, a figure appeared atop the small hill at the edge of town, silhouetted against the pale blue of the afternoon sky. Ethan Caldwell's horse shifted its weight, and he remained perfectly still, observing the scene with steady, calm eyes that contrasted sharply with the restless energy of the crowd. He adjusted the brim of his hat, letting the shadow fall across his face, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. The shuffling feet, the whispered judgments, the nervous coughs. Everything slowed as if waiting for something to happen. Lila's fingers flexed, tightening around the cloth in her hands, and she felt the weight of every gaze upon her, heavy as the noonday sun beating down on the square. Dust swirled around her ankles, catching the light in little motes that danced like tiny fireflies, and she felt a flicker of resolve amidst the fear. Ethan started down the slope, his boots scuffing the dirt gently, each step deliberate and unhurried, a silent promise that he was coming. Lila lifted her chin, catching the first glint of recognition in his dark eyes, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that shared glance, the unspoken understanding that she was not entirely alone. The air seemed thicker now, humid with anticipation, carrying the distant scent of sage from a wagon stacked with herbs, and the faint jingle of harness bells from the street behind. Lila's breath came in shallow gasps as she straightened slowly, brushing dust from her dress, and the laughter of the town no longer felt like an endless tide. It was a background murmur compared to the steady presence approaching from the hill. Every heartbeat in her chest synchronized with the rhythmic crunch of Ethan's boots on the dry soil, and the sunlight glinted once more off the horse's reins, drawing a thin line of silver across the sun-warmed wood beneath her feet. She took a cautious step, then another, feeling the texture of the planks beneath her worn shoes, the subtle vibrations carrying through the soles of her feet, and for the first time since arriving in town, she sensed a sliver of safety, a small, almost imperceptible space carved out by the silent determination of one man who had chosen to act when the world had not. The crowd seemed to fade at the edges of her vision, faces becoming less distinct, whispers dissolving into the dry wind, leaving only the faint clatter of distant wagons and the deep, grounding presence of Ethan, moving closer, a steady shadow growing larger with every deliberate step. Dust clung to Lila's hair, sticking in streaks along her temples, yet she found herself lifting her chin higher, letting the sunlight catch her face for a moment, tracing the curve of her jaw and the line of her shoulders. The warmth of the day, once oppressive, now seemed tempered by the approaching shade cast by the horse and its rider. Lila's hand brushed against the torn corner of a piece of paper caught in her dress, fluttering lightly. In the breeze, a subtle reminder of secrets she barely remembered, of stories half told, of moments suspended in time, waiting to be acknowledged. Ethan slowed as he reached the base of the hill, giving her the space to breathe, the silent message clear. You will be safe, at least for now. The wooden boards underfoot creaked slightly as Lila shifted her weight, dust rising around her in gentle clouds, mixing with the scent of distant pine and leather. She felt a flicker of courage bloom, fragile but real, as she glanced once more toward Ethan, then at the town behind her, and though fear had not entirely left her chest, the certainty that someone had chosen her well-being over the cruelty of the crowd brought a small, steadying calm. The world was not perfect, not yet, but for this moment, for this stretch of dusty boards and noonlit air, Lila Harper felt the first real hint that she might survive today, and that the shadow of kindness could exist even amidst the weight of scorn. The wind had begun to shift, carrying the faint scent of pine and dry grass across the narrow path leading out of town, and Lila followed Ethan Caldwell without a word, her steps careful on the uneven ground. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the rolling hills, painting everything in shades of amber and burnt sienna. The town faded behind them, the chatter of voices and the creak of wooden carts, now distant murmurs mingling with the rustle of the tall grasses that lined the trail. Lila's fingers brushed against the coarse fabric of her dress, still carrying the dust of the square, and she drew in a slow breath, letting the warmth of the afternoon sun fill her chest even as nerves whispered through her veins. Ethan's horse moved with a steady rhythm, hooves striking the dirt in measured cadence, and he walked beside her, guiding her with subtle gestures, never rushing, never pushing, only offering a presence solid enough to lean upon without demanding words. As they walked, the distant peaks of the surrounding hills began to take form, jagged and softened simultaneously by the golden haze of evening light. A faint bird call echoed from a ridge above, followed by the low hum of insects settling for the night, creating a quiet symphony that wrapped around the pair, giving a sense of space yet intimacy as they moved further from the familiar turmoil of the town. Lila's eyes, dark and wide, wandered over the landscape, taking in the patterns of the earth, the scattered rocks, and the way the wildflowers swayed, delicate against the rugged backdrop, and a faint smile traced her lips at the small beauty of it, a fragile thread of calm in the aftermath of humiliation. Ethan's gaze remained fixed ahead, surveying the trail, noting each rise and dip, the way shadows lengthened under the setting sun, and occasionally glancing at Lila to ensure she was steady, adjusting the strap of her satchel with the back of his hand, a motion both gentle and reassuring. The air carried hints of wood smoke from distant chimneys, mingling with the faint sweetness of dried sage and the earthy aroma of sun-baked soil, and the sounds of their own movement, the swish of skirts, the soft grind of boots against dirt, the shift of saddle leather, formed a rhythm almost meditative, a slow pulse that eased the tension coiled in Lila's shoulders. Small details drew her attention, a fallen feather drifting across the path, a sun-bleached branch, the way light caught in the folds of her hair as a breeze lifted it momentarily, and she began to notice the subtle cadence of Ethan's voice as he spoke in quiet tones about simple things, the landscape, the movement of clouds, the distant shape of a creek bending around a grove, each observation anchoring her to the present and away from the sharp edges of shame. The path widened as they approached a small rise, and a solitary tree stood as sentinel, its limbs outstretched like arms against the fading light, casting a patchwork of shadows over the earth that shifted with every whisper of wind. Lila paused for a moment beneath it, lifting her face to the sky, letting her eyes follow the curve of clouds tinged with pink and orange, and for the first time since that morning, she felt the stirring of a sense she had almost forgotten, that someone could be there to protect her, not for gain, not for attention, but simply because it was right. Ethan stopped a few paces behind, allowing her space, and the sound of the horse's hooves shifted to a slow rhythm as he led the animal to a small trough. At the edge of the trail, water glinting in the last rays of sun, Lila reached down, touching the cool surface, ripples spreading outward, reflecting the sky above, a mirror of the vastness surrounding them. In that moment, the enormity of the day, the humiliation, the laughter, the weight of watching eyes, seemed to settle into something smaller, more manageable, contained within the quiet stretches of trail and the gentle guidance of a man whose presence was steady, whose silence spoke of respect and patience. She took a deep breath, letting the tension drain from her muscles, and realized that every step forward was a choice, a reclamation of her own agency, guided by a figure who offered not judgment but steadiness, a tether to safety and possibility, and the horizon ahead, streaked with fading light, promised that the next chapter was not yet written, that the quiet of this journey held within it the first sparks of trust, and with trust, the faintest hint of hope. The sky deepened into shades of violet and copper as Ethan Caldwell led Lila Harper along the winding path that cut through the gentle slopes toward his homestead. The air had cooled, carrying the subtle scent of evening dew mingling with the faint aroma of wildflowers that clung stubbornly to the rocky earth. Lila's hands hovered near her satchel, feeling the slight weight of belongings she barely remembered, each item a fragment of a past she could not yet fully recall. She walked beside Ethan, matching his stride as the horse followed silently, ears flicking at the occasional distant rustle of a rabbit or the soft coo of a mourning dove perched along the fence posts. Shadows stretched longer across the ground, their shapes shifting with the subtle rise and fall of the hills, and for every step forward, Lila felt the tension of the town behind her loosen, replaced by a tentative curiosity about the world unfolding before her. Ethan spoke in quiet tones, his voice low but deliberate, describing the contours of the land, the placement of the creek just beyond the ridge, and the way the wind carried sounds differently across open plains versus sheltered valleys. Lila listened, absorbing not just the words but the rhythm, the cadence, the way each statement seemed designed to anchor her to the present. A fox darted across the trail ahead, pausing briefly to regard them, with bright eyes before disappearing into the brush, and Lila's gaze followed it, marveling at the ease with which small creatures navigated terrain she had only begun to notice. The homestead came into view, a modest wooden cabin with a stone chimney, smoke curling lazily toward the emerging stars, windows glowing warmly against the encroaching dusk. Ethan adjusted the horse's reins and gestured toward the cabin with a quiet nod, allowing Lila to step onto the porch first, the wooden boards creaking softly beneath her boots. Inside, the air was tinged with the comforting scent of fresh hay, dried herbs, and the faint sweetness of bread baking slowly in the oven, and she felt a flicker of ease that had eluded her all day. The cabin was modest but tidy, the furniture worn but cared for, each object carrying a story of labor, patience, and respect for what one possessed. Ethan moved to a corner, lifting a lantern to cast a soft, steady glow across the room, illuminating Lila's features in warm light and drawing her gaze to the simple but inviting table, the chairs arranged as though welcoming rather than imposing. Lila sank into one of the chairs, letting the events of the day settle around her, the distant echoes of laughter and scorn replaced by a profound quiet that seemed to wrap around her like a protective cloak. Ethan placed the horse's reins over a hook near the door and began preparing a small meal, chopping vegetables with deliberate precision, the rhythmic sound grounding them both. The lamplight flickered across the cabin walls, revealing the texture of hand-hewn beams and the faint scratches of long-ago carpentry, and Lila noticed for the first time the subtle order of things, the way care had been taken even in the simplest details. She traced her fingers along the edge of the table, feeling the worn grooves and the smooth polish left by countless meals and quiet conversations. Each sound, each scent, each movement seemed to weave a subtle reassurance that safety and attention existed not as commands, but as quiet presences she could choose to accept. Outside, the last hints of sunset faded into a deep indigo, stars beginning to prick the sky with soft points of light, and the distant hills became darkened silhouettes, a backdrop that made the cabin feel like a haven amidst a vast and patient wilderness. Lila drew a slow breath, tasting the evening air through the open door, and with it, a tentative sense of belonging began to take root, fragile yet undeniable, as she realized that the journey forward might be guided not by the past she could not yet remember, but by the steady, deliberate care of the man who had led her from the square to this quiet refuge. Each passing moment settled like sediment, layering patience over fear, and Lila felt the faint pulse of hope begin to echo in her chest, the first quiet signal that perhaps tomorrow, and the days beyond, might be hers to navigate with courage and measured trust. Morning arrived slowly, brushing the hills with soft, golden light that spilled across Ethan Caldwell's homestead in gentle waves. Lila Harper awoke to the subtle warmth on her face, the scent of dew mingling with the earthy aroma of sun-baked wood and the faint sweetness of bread left cooling on the table. She rose cautiously, the mattress beneath her firm, yet yielding, supporting the first stretches of her stiff muscles from a night of unfamiliar rest. The cabin was quiet save for the soft creak of the wooden floorboards as Ethan moved about, preparing water and tending to chores with methodical precision, each sound echoing lightly in the small space and grounding Lila in a sense of rhythm and safety. She walked to the window and peered through the glass, noting how the sun illuminated the fields beyond, highlighting the gentle sway of grasses and the occasional silhouette of a grazing horse, casting elongated shadows that danced across the land. Her hands brushed the sill, rough but warm from the rising sun, and she inhaled deeply, letting the morning air fill her lungs and steady the faint tremor that lingered from yesterday's events. Ethan stepped beside her, offering a cup of warm water, his presence unhurried, his gaze steady, as though he were providing both company and reassurance without intrusion. Lila accepted the cup, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers, and lifted it slowly to her lips, tasting the mineral-tinged water and noting the faint scent of pine and smoke that clung to it. They moved together toward the kitchen table, the sunlight falling across the worn boards, highlighting scratches and grooves left by years of careful use, each mark telling a story of endurance and patient labor. Ethan laid out simple provisions, bread, cheese, and fresh fruit, and Lila found herself pausing, absorbing not just the nourishment but the care and consideration inherent in the arrangement. As she ate, she listened to the soft rhythm of Ethan's movements, the way he swept crumbs from the table and adjusted the placement of dishes, a quiet choreography of habit and attentiveness that reassured her. Outside, the breeze carried the scent of wild sage and distant grasses, rustling gently against the wooden walls, and a bird called from the edge of the orchard, its song clear and unhurried. Lila's gaze drifted across the room, taking in the way light fell upon Ethan's face, highlighting the lines of his jaw and the calm steadiness of his eyes, and she felt the stirrings of a tentative trust growing, fragile yet persistent. Ethan spoke in quiet tones, sharing stories of the land, the creek that cut through the valley, the seasons, and how each shaped the work and rhythm of life. And Lila absorbed the words, noting not just their content, but the patience and care with which they were spoken. She began to recognize small patterns, the way he anticipated her questions, the subtle gestures that allowed her to move freely without feeling watched, and the unspoken understanding that she was welcome to occupy the space at her own pace. The morning stretched into afternoon, sunlight warming the cabin and spilling into every corner, illuminating the textures of wood and stone, the faint dust particles floating lazily in the light, and Lila felt the tension from the prior day ease, replaced by a tentative curiosity about the land and the day ahead. Ethan led her outside, walking slowly across the homestead, pointing out landmarks, the bend of the creek, the old fence posts weathered by time, and the distant hills layered in mist and sunlight. Lila followed, absorbing the vastness and the subtle beauty of the plains, noticing how small movements, a ripple across water, the sway of grasses, the flight of a hawk, held attention and required presence to fully appreciate. Each step grounded her more firmly in the present, the weight of past shame fading in the light of steady companionship, the soft sounds of the morning forming a rhythm that spoke of patience, care, and the slow unfolding of trust between two people navigating the quiet, unhurried spaces of an awakening land. The afternoon stretched across the plains, golden and heavy with sunlight that warmed Lila Harper's shoulders as she followed Ethan Caldwell across the wide expanse behind the cabin. The fields undulated softly, dotted with rocks and tufts of wild grass that bent with each passing breeze, creating a shifting mosaic under the clear blue sky. Ethan walked beside her, hands brushing against the brim of his hat, adjusting the strap of his satchel, his movements deliberate and unhurried, each step measured to maintain a calm rhythm that seemed to settle the tension lingering in Lila's chest. She watched the land stretch toward the distant hills, noticing the patterns of sunlight across the ridges and the way the shadows of scattered clouds drifted lazily over the fields. The creek that cut through the property shimmered in the sunlight, its water catching glints of gold and silver as it wound between rocks and low banks, and the soft gurgle of flowing water reached her ears, carrying a faint freshness that mingled with the scent of sage and dry earth. Ethan paused at a bend in the trail where a cluster of wildflowers leaned into the sun, and he pointed toward a small grove of cottonwoods near the edge of the meadow, their leaves trembling with each whisper of wind. Lila took a careful step forward, feeling the uneven ground beneath her boots, the soft resistance of dirt and gravel grounding each movement. The morning's quiet had given way to the subtle chorus of the afternoon, birds calling to one another from the trees, a distant horse nicker echoing faintly from beyond a fence, and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, each sound layering into a tranquil rhythm that enveloped her senses. She reached out instinctively to brush the petals of a flower, noting the delicate texture against her fingertips, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to pause, to take in the breadth of the world around her, unhurried, without fear. Ethan moved to stand beside the creek, gesturing with a sweep of his hand toward the glinting water and low rocks, showing the way the current curved gently before disappearing behind a stand of trees. Lila followed, stepping carefully along the bank, feeling the subtle vibration of water beneath her feet as she moved across small stones, the coolness brushing through the soles of her boots, anchoring her to the present. They spoke little, their conversation measured, punctuated by pauses that allowed the sounds of the land to fill the space between words. Ethan described the seasonal changes in the creek, the movement of fish beneath the surface, and the way light shifted throughout the day, his voice low and steady, comforting without intrusion. Lila listened, absorbing the cadence, the attention to detail, the unspoken patience embedded in each observation, and she found her own breathing slowing to match the rhythm, the anxiety from the town receding further into the distance. A hawk passed overhead, circling against the wide sky, and Lila tilted her head to watch, tracing its graceful arc, the shadows of its wings fleeting across the ground, and she felt a flicker of wonder, a reminder that the world held more than the narrow corridor of yesterday's shame. Ethan reached into his satchel and produced a small notebook, pointing to sketches of the creek and surrounding land, tracing lines with careful fingers, showing her the patterns and hidden spots that might be useful for foraging or observation. Lila followed along, her fingers brushing the edges of the paper, noting the precision, the patience, the way he expected her to see, to notice, to consider. The sun dipped lower, casting a warm glow that made the creek sparkle like molten gold, and Lila inhaled deeply, tasting the freshness of water and earth mingled with the faint aroma of pine, realizing that the slow unfolding of afternoon, the quiet instruction, and the steady presence beside her offered a sense of security she had not known for many moons. Each step back toward the cabin at the edge of the grove felt lighter, measured, deliberate, as if the land itself conspired to ease her mind, carrying her forward into the evening with the promise of quiet discovery, reflection, and the subtle reassurance that patience and care could outlast the sharpest edge of yesterday's humiliation. The sun had begun its slow descent, brushing the western hills with a warm glow that spilled across the cabin and the surrounding fields, and Lila Harper felt a gentle quiet settle over her, as if the land itself exhaled after the long tension of the day. Ethan Caldwell moved with calm deliberation, tending to the small chores of the homestead, his hands steady as he carried water from the trough to the garden, adjusting the irrigation with careful precision, each movement deliberate, thoughtful, and unhurried. Lila followed, taking small, measured steps across the soft soil, noting the way the light caught the edges of the wildflowers that dotted the ground, illuminating their delicate petals in gold and amber, and she felt a subtle calm spread through her chest, the first sense of ease since the events in town. A gentle breeze moved through the tall grass, carrying the faint scent of sage and earth, rustling softly against the cabin walls and stirring the loose strands of her dark hair, and she let her gaze wander over the hills in the distance, where the last sunlight painted the horizon in a wash of rose and orange. Ethan paused beside a low fence, his eyes sweeping the expanse of land beyond the creek, noting the curve of the water and the way shadows lengthened over the rolling hills. And he gestured for Lila to come closer, his hand open in a quiet invitation, not commanding but offering her presence as a guide. She approached, feeling the texture of the weathered wood beneath her fingers, warm from the afternoon sun, and she inhaled slowly, tasting the mingled scents of pine, dry soil, and distant blooms, letting each breath anchor her more firmly in the calm of the homestead. The horse shifted its weight nearby, the sound of hooves and the faint creak of leather straps blending with the ambient hum of wind through the leaves and the distant call of a bird returning to its perch. Lila's eyes traced the path the creek followed, noting the shimmer of water over rocks and the gentle ripple as it passed under low-hanging branches, and she realized that each small observation seemed to unravel the tension coiled in her shoulders, loosening the grip of the day's earlier anxiety. Ethan spoke softly, pointing out features of the landscape, describing the movement of fish beneath the surface, the nesting places of birds, and the pattern of shadows cast by trees and rocks, his voice calm, measured, and steady, providing a rhythm that Lila unconsciously matched in her own breathing. She moved to a sunlit patch near the garden, letting the warmth touch her face and shoulders, and she ran her fingers over the rough texture of stones placed to mark the edge of a path, noting the careful spacing and alignment, the subtle order within the apparent randomness, and she felt a small thrill of understanding that patience and attention could create something meaningful. The light shifted slowly as the sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows across the fields and illuminating dust particles that floated lazily in the air, and Lila noticed how even the smallest movement, the sway of a branch, the shimmer of the creek, the flick of the horse's tail, held its own quiet beauty. She lifted her gaze to Ethan, noting the soft lines of his face in the golden light, the calm steadiness of his posture, and she felt a burgeoning sense of trust, fragile yet growing, a recognition that the day's journey had offered more than refuge. It had offered the first quiet assurances that the world, despite its earlier harshness, contained spaces where patience, attention, and care prevailed. Together, they moved back toward the cabin, the soft crunch of boots on the sun-warmed dirt blending with the gentle rustle of grass and the distant hum of the creek, each step measured, deliberate, and unhurried, carrying with it the quiet knowledge that the present moment, steady and attentive, held the first seeds of understanding, calm, and the slow unfolding of confidence that would guide Lila through the days ahead, her heart settling into a rhythm that matched the steady presence of the man who had led her from the town square into the welcoming embrace of the wide, sunlit land. The evening light softened across the homestead, painting the hills with streaks of rose and amber as Ethan Caldwell led Lila Harper toward the small orchard behind the cabin. The air carried the faint fragrance of ripening apples mixed with the scent of earth and wildflowers, a combination that seemed to steady her racing thoughts. Lila's fingers brushed against the rough bark of a nearby tree, grounding her as she moved, each step measured and careful along the uneven ground. Ethan moved beside her, his presence calm and deliberate, adjusting the position of a loose strap on the saddlebags and pausing occasionally to point out details in the orchard, the way sunlight caught the edges of leaves, the gentle sway of branches, and the quiet ripple of the wind through the grass. Birds returned to their nests in the twilight, calling softly to one another, and the distant hum of a creek wove through the orchard, adding a subtle rhythm to the peaceful tableau. Lila followed Ethan's gaze to a cluster of fallen apples, their skins warm from the sun, and she bent down to touch one, noticing the subtle variations in color, the faint scent of sweetness, and the way the fruit seemed to carry the warmth of the afternoon. Ethan spoke softly, explaining the patterns of growth, the seasons, and the importance of care in tending the land, his voice steady and unhurried, each word deliberate, drawing her attention to details she might have overlooked. Lila listened intently, noting not just the content of his words but the rhythm and cadence, the careful way he spoke that invited understanding rather than commanding it. The sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows and painting the orchard in shades of copper and gold, and Lila felt a gentle ease spread through her, a quiet reassurance that she was in a place of observation, learning, and patient guidance. A rabbit emerged cautiously from the underbrush, pausing to regard them before moving on, and Lila's eyes followed it, the small movement reinforcing the sense of quiet vigilance that surrounded them. Ethan gestured toward the distant hills, explaining the natural markers that guided travelers, the subtle shifts in terrain, and the way the land spoke in patterns to those willing to notice, his tone calm and informative, grounding her in the present moment. Lila's breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of his voice and the gentle rustle of leaves, and she began to feel a tentative confidence, a sense that the world, though vast and sometimes intimidating, held spaces where she could move deliberately, safely, and with growing awareness. The orchard opened to a small meadow, dew beginning to settle on the grass as the air cooled, and Ethan led her to a fallen log where they could sit, the wood warm from the afternoon sun, the surface rough but steady beneath her hands. Lila settled onto the log, watching the sky transition from amber to deepening violet, noticing the faint glow of stars beginning to pierce the dusk, and she felt a quiet connection to the land, the homestead, and the steady presence beside her. Ethan remained nearby, tending to simple tasks, adjusting the water containers and observing the distant ridge lines, his movements unhurried yet purposeful, demonstrating a rhythm and attentiveness that offered Lila both guidance and space. She traced her fingers along the log, feeling its texture, the small knots and grooves, noticing the patterns formed by years of exposure to sun and wind, and she allowed herself to breathe in fully, tasting the mixture of earth, fruit, and the faint smoke from a distant chimney, letting it fill her senses with reassurance and calm. The day faded slowly into twilight, the sounds of the orchard settling into quiet, the movement of animals soft and intermittent, and Lila felt the first real sense of understanding that patience, observation, and steady presence could provide a sanctuary, that even amidst uncertainty, the rhythm of the land and the measured guidance of a companion could create space for learning, reflection, and the subtle unfolding of trust that might carry her forward. The sun had disappeared behind the distant hills, leaving a gentle twilight that bathed the homestead in muted shades of purple and gold, and Lila Harper stood quietly at the edge of the orchard, her eyes tracing the curve of the creek as it glimmered faintly in the fading light. Ethan Caldwell moved beside her, his steps soft against the packed earth, guiding her toward a small bench beneath a large cottonwood whose limbs stretched protectively over the meadow. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and the faint sweetness of wild sage, mingling with the distant aroma of bread and herbs from the cabin, and Lila breathed it in slowly, feeling each inhalation anchor her more firmly in the calm of the evening. Shadows lengthened across the grass, shifting with the subtle movements of leaves and the occasional flutter of a bird returning to its nest, and Lila noticed the gentle interplay of light and dark, the quiet rhythm of nature that seemed to move in harmony with the steady cadence of Ethan's presence beside her. He spoke softly, pointing to the horizon where the hills met the sky, explaining the distant ridges, the direction of the wind, and the way the land could tell its own stories to those willing to observe, his words deliberate and measured, creating a rhythm that Lila absorbed with careful attention. She ran her fingers over the worn wood of the bench, feeling its rough texture, the smooth spots worn by years of use, and she let her mind follow the patterns of the land, noticing small details she had overlooked before, the curve of a branch, the glimmer of water against stones, the soft sway of grasses in the breeze. The creek whispered gently as it passed beneath low-hanging branches, carrying the subtle sound of flowing water that mingled with the rustle of leaves, the occasional call of a distant bird, and the soft, steady breathing of the horse tethered nearby. Lila's gaze shifted to Ethan, observing the calm strength in his posture, the quiet attentiveness in the way he watched the land and the sky, and she felt the slow unfolding of trust, fragile yet growing, as each moment of stillness and observation drew her further from the anxieties of the day. He lifted a small lantern from the cabin porch and set it on the bench, its warm glow casting gentle light across their faces and the surrounding meadow, and the flicker of flame illuminated the intricate patterns of leaves above, creating moving shadows that danced across the grass. Lila inhaled again, tasting the evening air, sensing the subtle shift from day to night, the cooling of the earth beneath her feet, and the gentle reassurance that the steady presence beside her offered a safety that extended beyond mere physical protection. Ethan's voice remained low, guiding her attention to small wonders, the shimmer of the creek, the pattern of stars beginning to emerge, the distant silhouette of a ridge line softened by twilight. And Lila felt a quiet sense of wonder, a gentle awareness that the world contained spaces for observation, reflection, and patience, that not every moment required action, that some moments simply asked for attentiveness and calm. As darkness deepened, the first stars punctuated the sky with delicate points of light, and Lila leaned back against the bench, feeling the steady rhythm of the land, the calm of the orchard, the warmth of the lantern, and the unhurried presence of Ethan Caldwell beside her, and she realized with subtle clarity that the day had carried her not just from the town to this place, but into the slow unfolding of trust, the beginning of understanding, and the quiet assurance that even the most uncertain paths could lead to spaces where safety, patience, and reflection were possible, where secrets could be approached with care, and where the night itself could hold promise for the unfolding of truth. The night had settled fully over the homestead, the sky a deep indigo, punctuated by countless stars that reflected faintly in the winding creek below, and Lila Harper sat quietly on the bench under the large cottonwood, her hands resting in her lap, as she absorbed the vast calm of the evening. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth, wild sage, and the faint smoke of a distant chimney, blending with the gentle fragrance of orchard fruit still warm from the day. Ethan Caldwell moved beside her with careful, deliberate steps, tending to simple chores with soft efficiency, adjusting a lantern to cast steady light across the porch and bench, illuminating their immediate space with a gentle glow that contrasted against the expansive darkness beyond. Lila's eyes followed the patterns of shadows cast by the tree branches, noticing the subtle movement as the wind stirred the leaves, and she felt a quiet stillness settle over her mind, the tension of past humiliation and uncertainty dissolving slowly into the steady rhythm of the night. Ethan spoke in low, measured tones, describing the subtle sounds of the land, the soft trickle of water over rocks, the distant rustle of nocturnal creatures, the faint chorus of crickets beginning their evening song. And Lila listened, noting not just the words but the cadence and care embedded in each one, feeling her own breathing align with the gentle pulse of the surroundings. The lantern flickered slightly as he adjusted it, throwing delicate patterns across the wooden boards and the surrounding grass, and she noticed the texture of the earth beneath her boots, the slight give of moss near the creek, and the faint glimmer of dew collecting on low leaves. A breeze whispered across the orchard, carrying the distant scent of pine and the warmth of sun-baked soil, brushing softly against Lila's hair and face, and she allowed herself a slow exhale, feeling each small detail of the night as a reminder of presence, patience, and the quiet unfolding of trust. Ethan guided her to a small clearing near the orchard edge, where the ground sloped gently toward the creek, and they stood side by side, observing the reflections of stars rippling across the water, the movement subtle and calming, each ripple a gentle rhythm to accompany the soft breathing of the land. Lila traced a finger along the worn edge of the bench, feeling the grooves and knots of the wood, noticing the intricate patterns shaped by years of use and exposure to sun and wind, and she felt a connection to the enduring steadiness of the homestead, the land, and the quiet diligence of Ethan Caldwell. They spoke intermittently, carefully, with measured pauses that allowed the sounds of night to fill the space, the cadence of conversation mirroring the gentle movements of the surrounding air, water, and earth. Lila's mind began to piece together fragments of memory, not yet complete, but illuminated by the calm and observant presence beside her, and she felt the first real stirrings of understanding, that her past, though hidden, could be approached without fear, with patience and care, and that the world, though vast and sometimes uncertain, held spaces where quiet attention, steady presence, and deliberate care could guide one safely. The stars deepened in brightness, and a faint silver glow reflected across the distant hills and creek, painting subtle lines of light along the horizon. Lila breathed slowly, deeply, feeling a sense of closure from the day's journey, the reconciliation of small fears with emerging trust, and a quiet assurance that tomorrow, and the days after, might carry the gentle unfolding of all truths long buried. As the calm night held her in its expansive, patient embrace, and Ethan's silent, steadfast presence beside her offered a final, enduring reassurance that she was no longer alone, that every step forward was supported, and that the homestead, the land, and the quiet night itself had become a refuge where reflection, revelation, and subtle justice could take root.